the world had a sort of enormous investment almost in their relationship. You'd write about them as one of the first global political couples. Did they? So I mean, did they basically sort of live very differently in public to how they lived in private throughout their marriage?
Well, they both understood the power of celebrity as a serious political tool, and they self-consciously put their marriage out there as an emblem of South Africa's story. You know, a beautiful couple is torn asunder. A young woman is left a single mother, waiting for her husband, who she loves very much, to return. And the day they do return is the day that their people are free. And those two, and the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement, used that story beautifully and made it into a global story, and used it with enormous skill. So they understood their marriage as a not just a political asset, but the political asset par excellence that their struggle had at its disposal.
And was that story ever true? Was it true at the beginning of their relationship? You know, was it when, or indeed the beginning of Nelson Mandela's incarceration? Was that a fairly accurate assessment of how things were then?
They were head over heels in love with each other at the beginning, and part of what they were in love with was what they looked like together. They were both people who wanted power. They were both people who understood the significance of appearance. And I think that just intuitively from the beginning, these two very ambitious, politically ambitious people understood that their marriage was going to take them places, and that was mixed up with deep personal sexual attraction. It was an electric relationship to begin with.
And tell me a bit about Nelson's prison love letters to Winnie. What do they tell us about him and about them?
So 27 years is a long, long time, and he understood that he had been severed from the heartland of his life, that his life was essentially frozen. And he worried a great deal that her life was going on and his wasn't, and that he would lose her, that by the time he came out, she would be somebody else. And so these letters that he wrote her are this constant attempt to remind her of how in love they were, of how on the very edge their relationship was, how daring and in a way unacceptable it was. And so he keeps reconjuring her as this 19, 20-year-old beauty who's just met him. But meanwhile, she's 30, 40, 50 years old. And she's reading these letters and, in a very disturbing way, understanding that he's growing more and more in love with her, but less and less knows who she actually is.
I mean, that's a sort of fascinating image. What were his as you say, 27 years is a long time. What were his expectations of her while he was in prison? Did he expect her to remain sort of faithful sexually, emotionally? And how did he respond when he found out that she hadn't been?
He never expected her to remain celibate. He understood that was utterly unreasonable. She was young and he was away indefinitely. He expected her to remain loyal, to come and see him, to keep the myth of their marriage alive because it was so important, to remain politically faithful to him. He was upset by her sexual relationships, not because she was unfaithful, but because they were so controversial, because they were so messy and in the public eye. And once or twice almost divorced her. You know, she was an incredibly complex person. Her sexual relationships were consuming and obsessive, and they were quite often with the wrong people. Once or twice they were with a police informer. And so it wasn't the fact that she was unfaithful. It was the manner in which her sexual life unfolded that became difficult for him.
And did he have like an epiphany in this regard when he realized that she wasn't the sweet 19-year-old he fell in love with, or did he sort of always know it? And as you say, he was just trying to remind her to have that public persona.
Well, by the very end of his incarceration in the late 1980s, when he was probably the most famous person in the world, he finally understood really that she was his political rival. He wanted a negotiated peaceful settlement to South Africa's conflict. What he feared most was civil war. By then, she was the very opposite. She thought that unless apartheid ended violently through mass insurrection, it wouldn't end at all. And so he discovered in literally the last months of his imprisonment, that what he feared most was now embedded in his very family. And it was a terrible revelation for him. But he also, the only life he knew was the life that he lived with her. And he just spun a fantasy around that life. It had become so part of his sense of self that he couldn't imagine walking out of prison without her. So he was trying to reconcile these two things, the fact that he had a political adversary as a wife, and that she was the woman he loved.
It's a remarkable thing to have, as you put it, to have a political adversary as a wife. Would you characterize her sort of her movement towards sort of violent anti-apartheid resistance as a sort of betrayal of her husband's politics, or was she in fact maybe closer to where they'd both been when they met, and he was the one who moderated and changed?
They both shifted. He became more moderate and she became much more radical. They were pretty close together at the beginning. They both absolutely believed in the importance of armed struggle, but in a measured and disciplined way. By the end of his incarceration, he wanted to call the armed struggle off because he wanted negotiated settlements, and she wanted to intensify it. So I'd say that they started more or less together, and he drifted one way and she exactly the other.
Mm. And look, when they, when he left prison, when they held hands and waved to cameras in 1990, when he left Robben Island, this is all going on in the background. What state was their marriage in at that moment?
Well, he walked out of prison 4 hours late because she was late, which was really a signal of how she felt about that day. She felt very ambivalent. And when she flew down to Cape Town to be with him and to walk out of prison with him, she brought her current lover with her.
Wow.
And he was one of the first, Mandela was, this lover was one of the first people Mandela saw when he walked out of prison. So she was saying to him, I'm not Penelope and you're not Odysseus. I haven't been waiting for you all this time. This is how things are.
And was she ambivalent about it because she felt that her position would be weakened by his sort of returning to the public arena?
Well, by then, her politics had drifted so far from his. She really had contempt for his politics by then. And yet she felt that she must remain married to him. She must keep the Mandela name because he was the star. So she was in this very awkward position. He was now an old man who she felt alienated from. She didn't identify with his politics, but she felt that politically she must remain in the marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, she'd been a sort of she'd been in the later years he was in prison. She'd become a very problematic figure in public. She was associated with a sort of a lot of violence and sort of verging on criminality. And did he use his power and his influence to protect her through this time and indeed afterwards?
He did, and it's a very sad moment in his career, but I think a deeply understandable one. He had just walked out of prison after 27 years. He was personally fragile, a little unstable. He had to find his feet. He'd also very suddenly become an enormously powerful person, and it took him a little while to learn what his power was for and what it wasn't. And at the beginning, he thought that his political power could save his marriage. And he did a couple of things he shouldn't have. He orchestrated it so that his wife would have a powerful position in his organization. She was on trial for kidnapping, and two very important witnesses disappeared just before the trial and ended up in a neighboring country. And although he didn't do that directly, people working for him did. So there was this very awkward, terrible moment of I think understandable personal instability, where he was finding his feet and discovering what the power that he had was for and what it couldn't do. And I think within 2 years, he absolutely understood that his power could not save his marriage.
And is there, in the sort of broader political sense, is there still a tension between their kind of competing visions of a post-apartheid South Africa, with sort of Mandela's more consensual legacy being questioned by a younger generation who perhaps wish it had all happened in a rather more militant fashion?
Well, ironically, the political tensions between them are now worse than they were when they were alive. In the last years of Winnie's life, she began to retell the story of their marriage. And essentially, she said that all these years that Nelson Mandela was in prison, he was divorced from Black experience and essentially no longer knew what it was like to be Black. And that's why he could negotiate a peaceful settlement, where she said, I was tortured, I faced the violence, I was the embodiment of Black experience, and that's why I couldn't accept a compromise solution. And many of today's young Black, particularly middle-class people who weren't around then, who are not quite sure exactly what happened, but are deeply disillusioned with the current order, by that story. It's a very powerful, attractive story.
Look, briefly, before I let you go, and I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but tell me about the trove of new material that you've based a lot of this on.
So as I said earlier, their private conversations when he was in prison were not private, they were recorded. And I stumbled across transcripts, thousands of pages of transcripts of conversations between them as I was writing this book. they're pretty tough documents to interpret because they knew that they were being recorded, and nothing that they say is transparent. It's not a transparent window onto their thoughts. But nonetheless, very, very intense, difficult stuff happens. They are actually conducting their relationship through these conversations, and they're volatile. You get to see who they are as human beings. I felt very fortunate to stumble across this material late in the day.